In August of 2012, at a private function celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Metal Gear series, Hideo Kojima would announce the next mainline Metal Gear title. He revealed that it would be called Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes, that Big Boss would return as the game's protagonist, and that the story would serve as a prologue to another game in the series. The game would then be announced to the public 2 days later, and as the release grew closer, Kojima would only continue to drop more info about the game, including the fact that the length of the cutscenes would be significantly reduced from that of MGS4, as he felt that long cutscenes had become outdated, which surely had nothing to do with the reception to that game. And nearly 2 years after the initial announcement, Ground Zeroes would eventually launch in March of 2014. So, how would Ground Zeroes carry on the story of Big Boss? And more importantly, how would it bring Metal Gear into the next generation? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 16th in a series of videos where I'm playing every Metal Gear game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along in preparation for Metal Gear Solid Delta. And while you don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with the series if you haven't seen them, so I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes is an action-adventure stealth game developed by Kojima Productions and published by Konami in 2014. The game is set only 1 year after the events of Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, serving as a direct follow-up to that game's story. We're being sent into a US prison camp in Cuba to rescue Chico, who recently vanished while on his way to an assignment in Cuba. We also plan to extract Paz, who MSF has recently discovered is not only still alive, but is also being held at the same camp for interrogation. Before deploying, we can also listen to some of the briefing tapes in the main menu, and here, we also learn that the IAEA wants to inspect Mother Base to ensure that we don't have any nuclear weapons. Big Boss initially doesn't want to allow the inspection, but Huey talks him into it, saying that he has a brilliant plan to hide Metal Gear Zeke from them, and Big Boss reluctantly agrees to let them inspect the base while we're out on our rescue mission. Actually starting up a new game though, we see a man with an inverted fox insignia on his jacket giving Chico a cassette player and asking him how it feels to play the traitor, implying that Chico has already been interrogated and given up information about MSF. The man then walks over to a helicopter, using some sort of tool to wipe the markings from the side of it, and saying that the Trojan horse is in. We get a little splash of text introducing this man to the audience as Skullface, which also tells us that he's the commander of the XOF. And I'm sure it's no coincidence that the XOF's logo and abbreviation is the exact inversion of the Fox unit. He and his men then board the helicopter and take off from the base, ripping off their XOF patches and throwing them out the side door, seemingly implying that these men are not who they say they are. We then see Snake arriving at the outskirts of the base, and we're introduced to his new voice actor. Instead of bringing David Hayter back to reprise his role as Snake, Kojima instead cast Kiefer Sutherland for the role this time around. We've known through interviews that Kojima always wanted to have a different voice actor for Big Boss as far back as when they were making Metal Gear Solid 3, with him actually wanting to get Kurt Russell for the role at the time, but when they weren't able to make that happen, they decided to just stick with David Hayter for the time being. So this is essentially just the result of Kojima's near decade-long ambition to have a Hollywood actor voice Big Boss, and while Sutherland certainly does a good job here, I do kind of miss Hayter's classic performance for the character. At the end of the day, both actors do a great job, and I'm glad that Kojima was finally able to get his wish of having them be voiced by different actors, but I feel like after this many games with Big Boss, we were far enough in that we should have just stuck with Hayter all the way through. Though, that being said, he was voiced by Richard Doyle back in Metal Gear Solid 4, but it's a little different when we're talking about a game where you actually play as Big Boss. Anyway, before getting into the gameplay of Ground Zeroes, I feel like we have to talk about the visuals on display here. The game might look fairly average nowadays, but this came out in early 2014. The game was developed using Konami's new Fox engine, and the level of fidelity achieved for its time is very impressive, especially when you consider that this game was also released on the PS3 and Xbox 360. In particular, I found the lighting engine to be especially ahead of its time, with the daytime lighting and the reflection of lights off of Snake's rain-soaked sneaking suit looking absolutely phenomenal. It even ran at 60 frames per second on the current gen consoles of the time. You guys remember when games actually looked good and ran at 60 frames per second on current gen consoles? Getting into the gameplay itself though, the controls here are super tight and refined, especially compared to what we saw in the PSP release of Peace Walker. This is one of those things that we can talk about for days when it's done poorly, but in a case like this where it's done well, it's pretty simple. Everything just feels smooth, satisfying, and most importantly, intuitive. If I had to pick one thing about the controls to talk about specifically, it would be that Snake's movement feels better than it ever has before. Crouch walking of course makes a return here, but unlike Peace Walker, crawling is also still an option. And all of Snake's animations in this game are all just so smooth and fluid, making something as simple as just sneaking around and not even doing anything fun to mess around with. Along with that, CQC seems pretty much untouched from Peace Walker, with every ability from that game being carried over. It's actually been made even better here too, with Snake now being able to grab or throw enemies from around corners, or even over small pieces of cover. This makes CQC feel even tighter than it ever has before, and allows for some really fun opportunities, like luring a guard over to a corner that you're hiding behind so that you can quickly pull them around that corner to interrogate them or knock them out. Along with that, you can now draw your sidearm while using CQC, opening up opportunities for some really cool moments. There was one time during my playthrough where I went to interrogate a guard, but as I started doing so, another guard that I had already knocked out started to wake up, so I quickly pulled out my tranquilizer gun to knock him back out again before getting to the guy that I had just grabbed. For those of you who have been actively keeping up with the series, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but I really love the CQC mechanics in these games, and Ground Zeroes simply offers the best iteration of them so far, so it's a slam dunk for me. Continuing along with the new stuff, it's also now possible to mark enemies and track their movements through walls. This can be done either by using Big Boss's binoculars, which are constantly bound to the right bumper, or by clicking in the right thumbstick to focus and looking at one of the guards to mark them. At first, this might seem like a really dumb way to make the game more accessible for casual players, but there are actually a lot of other changes to the game that balance this addition out. One of these is that enemies are much more aware than they have been in the last few Metal Gear Solid games, meaning it's a lot harder to stay hidden here. Interestingly, how easily you're detected also changes with the time of day, with Snake obviously standing out a lot more in clear weather during the daytime than he does in a storm at night. The heightened awareness of enemies makes marking and tracking them almost essential, as if you're not using all of that info to your advantage and carefully planning out your movements ahead of time, the base will be on alert before you know it. And speaking of using information to your advantage, we have to talk about how you navigate the base. I haven't mentioned it yet, but during the lead up to this game's release, it was being marketed as the first ever open world Metal Gear title. Immediately when players arrive at the base, they're free to explore it however they please, but I have to say, marketing this as open world is definitely a stretch. The map is very large compared to the levels of previous Metal Gear games, but if we're calling this an open world game, it's easily the smallest open world that I've ever seen. To be clear, this isn't a dig at the actual quality of the game, as the base is actually a blast to explore and approach as you please. It's more just to point out that the marketing for this game was a bit strange. Back to the point though, players can press the start button on the controller at any time to open up a map of the base, and this helps a ton with navigating the map. The general area that your main objective is in will be highlighted, allowing you to make your way over there and start exploring that specific region without just telling you exactly where it is. Along with that, using CQC to interrogate the guards is more valuable than ever here, as they'll tell you things like camera placements, where certain weapons or ammo are stored, and more, and these pieces of info will then be marked on your map, allowing you to navigate straight to them or use them to your advantage. Filling out the map and finding all the little goodies spread throughout the base was really enjoyable, so much so that I repeatedly went out of my way to interrogate guards that I didn't even need to mess with just so that I could find a little bit more. Once I have all that exploring out of my system though, I make my way over towards the objective, eventually finding Chico in a cage. After Snake unlocks the cage, Chico tries to fight back against him, likely thinking that he's there to kill him rather than rescue him, so Snake chokes him out and we get a call from Kaz. We tell him that we found Chico, and he asks if we found Paz as well, but Snake tells him that she isn't here. He tells us to get Chico out of there and says that we'll figure out where Paz is once he's calmed down a bit, so we call in an extraction chopper and carry him over to it. On our way there though, he wakes up and starts crying, telling us that they killed Paz. And here, we actually come to another new addition of Ground Zeroes, that being calling in a helicopter for extraction. This can be done at any time, and you can choose a variety of landing points on the map, allowing players to opt for a low-risk pickup on the outskirts of the base, or call it in directly in the center of the base for an intense escape. You can use these helicopters to extract POWs like Chico, and even any of the random prisoners also being held on the base should you choose to do so. The only way to successfully complete a mission in this game is to extract via helicopter, so players will need to get used to engaging with the mechanic and figure out strategies for all of their favorite landing spots in order to be successful. Once Chico is safely extracted, we listen to the tape that he had on him when we found him, in which we hear him being moved around the base, giving us some clues about where he was taken based on the sounds that we can hear along the way. At the end of the tape, we also hear Chico say Paz's name, and we hear her screaming out in pain before the tape cuts off. This could have been a really fun puzzle for players to have to solve in order to find Paz, but Ground Zeroes commits one of the gravest of gaming sins here. While you're listening to the tape, Kaz will be talking to you over the radio, explaining all the different sounds to the player before they even have the chance to think about them for themselves. So he'll say something like, "I hear a flag," while you're listening to the tape, and then to make it even worse, when you start moving through the base again, if you get close to a flag waving around in the wind, Kaz will contact you via radio again to point out that you found the flag from the tape, and then remind you where you should be going next based off of that. I just hate when games do this, man. Like, you put in this really cool puzzle for players to solve, but then you lost confidence in the player's ability to actually figure it out, so you just have a character in the game explaining it to them every step of the way without ever even giving them a chance to actually engage with it. Regardless though, we start moving back through the base, slowly retracing the path that Chico took in the tape. On the way there was also this really cool moment where I shot out a security camera, which caused Command to call a nearby guard and ask him to check it out. I thought I was being smart by tranquilizing the guard before he actually got to it, but a few seconds later, he was called again for an update, and when he didn't respond, the whole base went into alert status. Guards communicating like this was present way back in games like MGS 2 and 3, but it's been absent from the series for a while at this point, and seeing it not only return, but also be refined even more was really nice and pushed me to think about the possible consequences of just about every move I made. Another new mechanic that really came into play as I snuck into the most heavily guarded part of the base is Snake's new reflex mode. When the player is spotted by an enemy soldier, they can quickly draw their weapon to slow down time for a few seconds, allowing them an opportunity to quickly drop or knock out the guard without raising an alert. I'm a bit mixed on this mechanic, as on one hand, I feel that the increased awareness from soldiers is somewhat balanced by this, but on the other, I feel like reflex mode weighs things a bit too much in the player's favor. You won't always be able to prevent an alert when reflex mode is activated, but you'll be able to drop the enemy soldier in more situations than not when using it, meaning that you generally just get a freebie in situations where you made a mistake and should have raised an alert as a result. Using reflex mode will hurt your mission rank, but that's not really a significant enough downside to discourage the majority of players from using it, meaning that most people will just activate reflex mode every single time they're spotted and get away with stuff that they really shouldn't be able to. And while we're on the topic of balancing issues, the tranquilizer pistol has once again become even stronger than in previous games. As I talked about in previous videos, the gameplay balancing of both Portable Ops and Peace Walker was eviscerated by the tranquilizer pistol thanks to every mission starting you off with full suppressor durability and ammo, regardless of how much you abused it in previous missions. So how could they have possibly made it stronger here in Ground Zeroes? Well, they've gotten rid of the suppressor durability on it entirely, meaning that this is now a permanently silent option. This is a pretty straightforward buff, simply just making it so that there's no downside to using the tranq gun on just about every guard you cross paths with. Curiously enough, this is also the only weapon in Ground Zeroes with a permanent suppressor. This is most likely because the new tranquilizer gun uses an integrated suppressor, but that doesn't mean that it's a change that I'm just going to look past, as that was still a conscious choice from the designers and has a very drastic effect on the gameplay experience. Anyway, I eventually reached the basement of the admin building, finding Paz tied up down there. She's not really able to speak, so we just cut her out of there and carry her out for extraction. On the way out though, she seems to be in a great deal of pain whenever we move, constantly repeating things like "don't" or "my stomach." Once we've safely extracted from the base, Chico notices that she's bleeding, opening up her shirt to find a large V-shaped wound on her stomach that's been stitched up. Snake says that she's rigged, and a medic on board opens the wound back up, and we hold her down as he slowly and painfully digs around in her guts, eventually finding a brick with a peace sign painted on it. We throw it out the side door of the chopper, and the medic gets on treating the wound and stitching her back up. Shortly after, we arrive back at Mother Base, finding that it's been set ablaze and is actively under attack. We land as quickly as we can, joining our men in defending the base. After a short bit, Snake realizes that it's a losing battle, so we get Kazuhiro Miller on board the chopper before taking back off and escaping as the base quite literally starts to sink into the ocean. Miller tells us that the inspection was nothing but a smokescreen for the attack, turning his attention to Paz and yelling at her to start talking. She tries to tell us that there's a bomb, but Snake interrupts her, saying that we already got it out. She then goes over and opens up the side door of the chopper, saying that there's another, jumping backwards out of the helicopter just before exploding midair, and sending us into a spiral that leads to a crash with another helicopter nearby. We then get a wall of text telling us that the media blamed the disaster on money-minded private militias, and that the Secretary of Defense publicly stated that neither the US nor its allies had anything to do with it. The UN and the IAEA also insisted that they were never there, denying that any inspection had ever taken place. We're told that there are no known survivors before fading to credits and hearing Skullface's voice. He asks if whoever he's talking to believes that their sacrifice will actually change the world before we hear the tape abruptly end. However, we then get a post-credits scene where we hear from Skullface again. He says that no one has seen Cypher in years except for whoever he's talking with, saying that they met with him face to face in order to contact Big Boss. He demands that they tell him where Cypher is and confirms that his true identity is in fact Zero. He says that he's never had the freedom of choice, but that the person that he's talking to has the freedom to choose right now whether they tell him or not. We then hear Paz ask him if this will save Big Boss, and he tells her that it might. She asks Skullface if he really will kill Zero, and he promises that he will. She starts to tell him where Zero is hiding before the scene abruptly ends once again, leaving us on a massive cliffhanger. And finally, we get a wall of text with a bunch of important world events that mostly serve as additional world building, but at the bottom, it shows a couple of fairly recent dates that talk about the US detention facility in Guantanamo Bay. This is a real detention facility that was opened during the War on Terror that the US used to hold prisoners indefinitely without trial, which is a massive breach of human rights as written in the United States Bill of Rights. It also mentions here that President Barack Obama had promised to shut down the facility in 2008, and for anyone who isn't aware, the facility is actually still open and holding prisoners to this day, so it's likely here to serve as a bit of commentary that illegal camps like the one seen in the game are still used by world governments to this day. And last, but certainly not least, the game plays the first official reveal trailer of Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. And with the post-credits stuff all wrapped up, that's all for the main story here in Ground Zeroes. There is still more content to go through, which we'll come back to in a minute, but everything that takes place in missions outside of this initial main story mission is either flat out non-canon or dubious canon at best. From what I can tell, this was most people's biggest issue with Ground Zeroes at launch, and playing the game for the first time nowadays, I would have to agree. What we get here in terms of gameplay and story is so good, but just so short. For context, I really took my time playing through this one, even listening to all of the cassette tapes in the menu before deploying and exploring for as many hidden goodies as I could while in the level, and the entire experience from opening the game for the first time to seeing the post-credits scene took me about an hour and 50 minutes to get through. However, like I just said, there are still some things here to give a little more value to the package overall. Once you complete the game's singular main mission, 4 side missions open up that are very reminiscent of what we saw with the side ops back in Peace Walker. These are small missions, typically taking around 15 minutes apiece, that see players returning to the prison camp to complete a smaller objective before extracting back out of there. Some of these are an absolute blast too, like the one where we assault the base from the side door of a helicopter in order to rescue a spy of ours, and once we've safely extracted him, the spy turns out to be none other than Hideo Kojima himself. And while I know that a lot of people really don't like Kojima nowadays, there's just something so fun about the director of the game inserting himself as a random little side character. As fun as these are though, it's a bit hard to get past the fact that they all take place on the same map as the original story mission. They do try to change things up a little bit by having the side ops take place at different times of day, but it's just not enough to make things feel meaningfully different across multiple hours of gameplay. Like, sure, it means that I might be harder or easier to detect every time I deploy, but it doesn't change the fact that it's still the same map, and I've already figured out how to navigate it, and all the best places to hide from guards, and just other things like that. And while the game isn't too difficult on normal mode, there is a hard mode on offer that can be played on any mission that you've already completed. This is a nice addition for players who like a bit more of a challenge, doing various things to increase the difficulty, like making enemies even more aware, increasing the amount of damage that enemies deal, and even taking away the silenced assault rifle that Snake starts with on normal difficulty, making it even more important to scavenge for weapons on sight. I didn't play around with hard mode too much while recording for this video, but what I played was really fun, and I'll definitely be going back to clear the game on it someday. And to add even more replayability, the mission rank system from Peace Walker returns once again. This time around, clearing a mission with a certain rank will earn the player certain bonuses, like being able to start the mission with different weapons that weren't available to them before. Most players won't care enough to play through the missions multiple times just to earn a higher rank, but for completionists, or for players who want to start with a shotgun and just go on a rampage, it's a great addition to have here. And there are some other fun bonuses that can be earned by completing side ops or from exploring the base, with my favorite of these being a series of tapes that Chico recorded while imprisoned in Cuba, giving us a first-hand look at what it was like to be held there for the week or so that he was before we rescued him. They've also thrown in some new lore by allowing players to listen to Paz's spy log that she recorded while infiltrating Mother Base during the events of Peace Walker. These sorts of things go a long way to not just flesh out the world of the series, but also give players a much better understanding of the characters that inhabit it, and I personally really enjoyed listening to them during my playthrough. Overall, I really enjoyed my time with Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes. The game looks amazing for its time, I think the gameplay is fantastic, and even though there's not a lot of story content here, what is here is pretty great and has me itching to start up MGS5 proper to figure out what happens next. That being said though, as great as everything is, I can definitely see why a lot of fans were upset with this game back when it was first released. At launch, Konami was selling this game for $40, which is just frankly way more than it's worth. I tried to squeeze just about everything I could out of this game, doing all the side missions, listening to all the tapes, and even playing around with hard mode for a bit, and it still only took me 4.5 hours to do all of that. The game is fantastic, but to charge a near premium price for what is at most 2 hours of main content with a couple hours of additional side content sprinkled in just doesn't sit well with me at all. Konami did lower the price to $30 very shortly after launch in response to the backlash, and nowadays the game is listed at a full price of $20 and often goes on sale for as little as $2, but that doesn't change the fact that there are so many fans out there who picked the game up for $40, not realizing just how little game there actually was here. The game is genuinely so good, but it's basically like selling MGS2's tanker section as a $40 package, and then selling the big shell portion of the game for an additional $60 a year later. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes an 8 out of 10. Hey guys, thanks for watching all the way through. I just want to take a moment here at the end of the video to mention that the MGS5 video is probably going to take a little while for me to get done, thanks to the sheer size of that game, so any sort of patience on it is much appreciated, as I have no idea what I'm really getting into, other than the fact that it's just going to be a very large undertaking. If you want to keep up to date with progress on the video, get early access when it's done, and just generally help keep the series rolling, maybe consider backing me on Patreon. Either way, thanks for watching, and I hope to see all of you back here for the next Metal Gear review.